Hello and welcome back to Myelopathy Matters, the official podcast of the charity Myelopathy.org.
Where we talk all things degenerative cervical myelopathy from the perspective of the professionals, the researchers and the people living with myelopathy.
I'm Iwan Sadler, person with DCM and a founder of Myelopathy.org.
And I'm Ben Davies, neurosurgeon scientist and also founder of Myelopathy.org.
This is Myelopathy Matters.
So today we're turning our attention to the far side of the world, New Zealand, where our guest Rohil Chauhan comes from.
Oh, New Zealand. That's the word that strikes fear into the hearts of any rugby fan. But I'm glad we ain't discussing the Rugby World Cup. But yes, it's great that our reach is improving and we can improve pathways for people with DCM. So I'm looking forward to this interview.
You're quite right, actually, thinking about that. And a Welshman, an Englishman and a Kiwi on a call together, we did certainly commiserate on the topic of rugby. But this is keeping it all to myelopathy, because whilst New Zealand may be a long way from the UK for myelopathy, there are still the same challenges, which means plenty of opportunity for shared solutions. So Rohil's been working with frontline professionals to understand their awareness of DCM with some very interesting lessons. So I'm delighted to welcome Rohil Chauhan from New Zealand, physiotherapist by background, now working in a diagnostic and triage role in Auckland. Welcome, Rohil.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Ewan. Thanks for the invite. It's been really great sitting and listening in on some of the other podcasts and seeing the work that's come of the Recode project and the Myelopathy.org incubators. So I'm pleased to be here.
Well, we're pleased to have you, and we're really interested to tap into your experience of trying to identify myelopathy, which we know is a challenge, and it's sort of how we met, and really delighted that something like Myelopathy.org can bring together all these perspectives from different professions, different locations around the globe to work on what is ultimately the critical challenge, I think, for this condition. So perhaps we could start really by, talking to you about what your experience of identifying and managing myelopathy, and I guess why you became interested in it.
So my background is within physiotherapy, working in private practice and musculoskeletal, but over the past couple of years, I've been working with a spine surgeon in the triage and diagnosis of spine cases. And it was only when I was going through routine assessments for all these patients who were presenting with other spinal conditions where I came across a lot of incidental cases of myelopathy. People who came in with other concurring presentations of lumbar radiculopathy or lumbar spinal stenosis. And it was only when we investigated further we found actually these people also have DCM, but it just took a close eye to identify them.
How did you take an interest to go a little bit beyond in terms of how, you were trying to explore beyond maybe the focus of what their symptoms were?
For me, it started as I was seeing patients for the spine surgeon. I felt it was my responsibility to make sure I'm not missing anything. And I was going through full subjective histories and full neurological examinations to make sure that I'm crossing my T's and dotting my I's. And it was only when I started doing those examinations, I started realizing there are some of these signs which I previously weren't performing, that now I'm seeing these patients actually have signs that are worth exploring further.
That's really interesting. Because I think if I draw parallels into the United Kingdom, where we have about half the patients with myelopathy come through a similar formula. We have this thing called the musculoskeletal service, which is an interface between primary and secondary care, which is largely run by physiotherapists, trained practitioners, so advanced ESPs or whatever the terminology is. And they are designed to have a similar role, but I don't know necessarily in all cases whether it's being as effective as perhaps your experience is. And I just wonder whether that's a question of the awareness amongst physiotherapists for myelopathy. You've chosen to take a very comprehensive approach, but is that shared, do you think, by your colleagues everywhere?
Yeah, agreed. I think the setting that I work in, like I said, is quite unique in New Zealand. In secondary care here, where we're getting direct referrals from primary care, secondary care is mainly led by the specialists. There aren't those advanced practice or advanced scope physiotherapists who are working in secondary care. Generally, the advanced scope physios are working in tertiary care where they do have this triage kind of role, but that's not so much happening in secondary care. In the majority of physiotherapists are working in more primary care roles, and I agree with you that the awareness there based on our previous studies is low.
So that's really interesting, because I'm sort of getting a sentiment that, this triage role from a very focused and well-trained professional is incredibly valuable. But clearly there needs to be an awareness of the potential differentials like myelopathy. And it's clear that, we also see that the knowledge and awareness of myelopathy is low. And I know that's something you've been trying to promote now in the role that you have and the experience that you've gained amongst your colleagues in New Zealand. I just wanted to hear a little bit about, what's that experience been like, promoting the message and raising awareness.
So as you will have seen, we ran a survey to understand New Zealand primary healthcare's awareness of DCM and how confident they were to screen for it. And we got over 300 responses. And primary care, the clinicians we were interested in was the awareness of GPs, physiotherapists, chiropractors, osteopaths, and nurse practitioners who make up our primary care. And again, these clinicians are very much generalists. So while osteos, physios, and chiros will work in a musculoskeletal field, they won't have the advanced training in spinal diagnostics that a lot of the clinicians in secondary and tertiary care will have. So we just wanted to know how well are these people aware of the condition, how confident they are to be able to screen for it. And our findings suggested that only 1 in 5 clinicians were quite aware of the condition, and even less, 16%, were quite confident to be able to screen for the signs and symptoms. And further, when we looked at the clinicians who were quite confident, we found that there was quite a lot of variation in the signs and symptoms that they had chosen in terms of a diagnostic criteria. While the symptoms of gait disturbance, hand dexterity decline, neck pain and stiffness, and upper limb pain and paresthesia were reasonably well identified, it was the signs, the clinical tests, that there was a lot less confidence and a lot less awareness of which tests would give what results and what that would mean in terms of escalating care for these patients. Generally, the majority of patients who answered were quite confident in knowing who the best person to refer to was, and they generally would answer on the basis of what local networks and pathways they had, but generally an orthopedic spine surgeon, neurosurgeon, or neurologist were the 3 avenues that majority of respondents had chosen.
I'd like to pick up on that a bit more detail because I think this is really interesting shared knowledge, because what you're sort of learning there, I think, is that once a clinician or practitioner is suspecting myelopathy, then the process they seem to know what to do. Is that your sense of that information? Correct.
What we found is that if clinicians were able to pick the right signs and symptoms, put it together, then they seem to be quite understanding of what their pathways are, confirm the diagnosis.
But it's that initial hurdle of getting it into their mind to think about it and then trying to give them the confidence to bring a few things together to help them refine their differential, I think, which is a big challenge for us.
Correct. And that kind of speaks to such large variation in some of the symptom presentations and the non-specificity of a lot of these symptoms that patients will complain of, because they won't necessarily come and tell you, I've got these combinations of symptoms, unless the patient themselves is aware of it. And I think that also speaks to the role that I think physiotherapists, even working in primary care, have. It's quite known that physiotherapists will generally follow up with patients in private practice over extended periods of time, and generally will have longer consultation times. So we've got that potential to build a really good rapport with our patients and really get to understand the emergence of any symptoms that may emerge over the treatment period.
One of the things I want to come back to you, Rohil, which is really impressed by what you managed to put together there, is that, my experience so far of trying to get to this front door audience is that it's really difficult, but in your survey, you've got 300 practitioners there who have really bought into this survey and this problem that you're trying to look at. I just wondered whether, questions aside, whether you had a sort of sense of what drew them in, how did you persuade them to get interested, and a bit more of that sort of detail, really, because they're a difficult audience, because, fundamentally they are, particularly GPs, they are being under pressure to update their knowledge about so many conditions. How we get through to them about this particular disease is a big challenge.
Agreed, Ben. Yeah, amongst all the individual communities that we tried to reach of clinicians, it was difficult, and currently GPs the GPs here have a lot of pressure on them, and that we found when we reached out to the organizations to disseminate our survey, it was difficult.
And I know you've had an opportunity to go around and share the findings of your survey, and I just wondered, what's been the reception to that information? Has there been a sense of where you need to go now on the back of that?
Yeah, some of the information that we've found has been quite eye-opening, and we've seen a lot of raised eyebrows when we're presenting some of this information, again, in surprise, that the significant delays to diagnosis that these patients are having, and the as a result, the subsequent worse long-term outcomes that is happening. Recovery of function, once people have lost function, is quite variable, and therefore identifying these cases earlier and getting them to see spine and neurosurgeons earlier is important. And so those kind of messages that we're finding are kind of hitting home to people and getting people more interested in when we are presenting.
So it's come across very clearly from the work that you've done that, though in some capacity, although there's clearly a bit more detail, that the musculoskeletal practitioners, the osteopaths, physios, chiropractors, etc., are going to be a really key audience in promoting the awareness and accelerating diagnosis in myelopathy. I just wonder whether your experiences more outside of myelopathy have shown you any potential avenues that we can transfer here, I guess, in terms of getting the message out there, but improving the education to that audience.
And during my time working within spine, DCM has certainly been one of the main first conditions that, I've had the strong urge to try and raise awareness and simplify the approach for early identification, assessment, and triage for these cases. And mainly because we have a specific condition here with an unfortunately progressive condition trajectory that we can play a valuable part in identifying early, mainly if we're aware of it. But I think some of the information that we see in other conditions that could be quite helpful with DCM is, firstly, obviously, we're talking about the diagnostic criteria, which you guys are doing a lot of work on, is also having some good epidemiological data just to help clinicians appreciate the extent of DCM, and that, these people living with DCM aren't necessarily just waiting at surgical waiting rooms, but they're probably waiting in your primary care waiting rooms as well, just waiting for clinicians to pull together these symptoms and how relevant that they might be. So I think having some good epidemiological data of community dwelling presentations of people with DCM, while that's quite difficult for research, that would be quite useful for clinicians to have, to say, actually, this is a relatively common condition. We're just not, we haven't done such a great job in pulling together these symptoms and signs yet. As well as risk factors and what kind of populations do we expect to find people with DCM, and if we look closely enough and do full subjective histories and clinical examinations, what are the populations that we expect to find need further investigations and workup for DCM? I think if we have good epidemiological data and good understanding of risk factors, I think that plays in really well with proposed diagnostic criteria that are hopefully likely to come out over the next couple of years. We've got good data on how common DCM is, along with the populations that are more at risk for developing DCM or testing positive in our primary, secondary, and tertiary clinics. I think that combined information is very, very valuable, and that's the kind of information that we see with other health conditions such as osteoarthritis, and that really helps clinicians put these into context to be able to identify these cases earlier.
Brilliant. Well, that's fascinating to hear, Rohil. I think we're clearly hearing that there are, some simple opportunities. There's clearly some knowledge gaps in terms of the kind of knowledge we need to give people, but lots of areas for progress. We wanted to pivot slightly because, having the benefits of your expertise on the podcast today, Ewan has been asking in the support group of any burning questions that people had or needed answering they thought that might be best placed to you. It's going to go beyond a little bit your current particular role in diagnosis and triage to the sort of role of physiotherapy in myelopathy. But perhaps over to you, Ewan, you can take over the questioning.
Yeah, welcome, Rohil, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to ask these questions. So, are there any specific exercises or therapies that are effective for improving mobility, staying active, and maintaining overall well-being?
Thanks, Ewan, and once again, thanks for having me on the podcast. As part of the work we were doing on the perioperative incubator, we were looking at doing literature searches on the available evidence for physiotherapy and other non-operative management strategies for people with DCM. And there was limited research. There was limited research that was had been conducted on the non-operative approaches for DCM, and obviously this has been a very surgical and orthopedic-led kind of field of research. But while there was some research that we've seen for single-level soft disc herniations in people with DCM, where there's some evidence for soft collar use and intermittent traction that are generally supervised by physiotherapists to help with pain, and there is some evidence on improvements in pain with this. There's also some evidence in terms of, I know you've had on your previous podcast, you've had some discussions about the chronic changes that go through in muscles as a result of spinal cord compression and nerve compromise. I don't think the research at this stage is conclusive. There certainly isn't enough research looking at specific exercise-based interventions or manual therapy approaches to help, but my gut feeling would say that exercise strengthening around the muscles of the neck, especially the extensors and the flexors, to be able to help people develop better control, should have good benefit. I think the progressive nature of the condition would be difficult to affect. It would be difficult to affect the disability that people face, but I think there should be good improvements in pain. That was what my gut would say. But again, plenty of research that needs to be done in that space.
Yeah, because, myelopathy from one person to another person is totally different. The levels of disability, can range so much as well.
Within physiotherapy, there's been a lot of research in our modern understanding of manual therapy. And we understand manual therapy not only has a role from a biomechanical point of view where pressure is applied onto the neck or different areas to the muscles. We know there are neurophysiological changes that happen as a result of applying pressure to certain areas and getting people exercising as well. So there are certainly a lot of manual therapy based, which are hands-on approaches that physiotherapists are generally traditionally using that may have a lot of impact for whether it be short or medium-term pain reduction. But again, these studies haven't been done specifically in this population, but general people with neck pain or radiculopathy.
Are there any advancements or emerging trends in physiotherapy that shows promise for myelopathy patients?
I think the emerging trends within physiotherapy research has all been about tailoring and giving individualized care to patients. And this extends outside of people living with myelopathies, just ability to rotate their neck and perform just basic day-to-day tasks. And while those are very, very important, but we also like to look at that patient as that person as an individual, and what are the things that are important for those people to be able to do in their day-to-day lives. What are the roles that they identify with, and what limitation their neck pain and their inability to perform tasks is having on their life. So we try and become very goal orientated in the rehab that we give to patients. So it's not, there's definitely not a one size fits all as with everything, but generally we will aim to give exercises and provide manual therapy in a manner that is helping people get back to the goals that are of importance to them. And so that's probably the most trendiest and probably the most best thing we can offer our patients.
Yeah, I remember having acupuncture, and actually acupuncture worked for me. It released the muscles and everything. But, you've got a handful of people in the group then that they've tried acupuncture and it hasn't really worked for them. So like you say, there's no sort of one fits all sort of therapy out there, is there?
I agree, and that is probably quite similar amongst quite a few different conditions that we treat around the neck or just the musculoskeletal system. And like you say, there are some people who respond quite well to different variations of acupuncture, some who will respond very well to hands-on therapies, and some who will respond to adjuncts, so just like massage or cupping, and I think the majority of it, while these conditions are quite safe and low risk, I think if patients have responded well to one or the other, I think it's useful to utilize that while still incorporating exercise-based rehab to make sure that patients are getting stronger and more confident in doing the tasks that they would like to get back to. But I think I think that's quite similar in a lot of other musculoskeletal conditions, that it can be quite variable how people respond, and it's less to do with the intervention, probably more to do with how people are responding to the particular intervention.
Is there a sense there perhaps that in many situations there's less of a need to reach a diagnosis as a physiotherapist, more to recognize the sort of burden of symptoms and the sort of goals of the patient then?
Yes, there's been a lot of emphasis on that on physiotherapy research, and clinicians are very much focused on identifying what are the goals that patients would like to achieve and helping them get on that track. While diagnosis is important, it's often dichotomized as you have red flags or specific pathology versus you have a self-limiting condition that if you monitor over time and having effective pain relief and exercise over time, this should get better. So there hasn't been an emphasis on providing a specific diagnosis. And we know in primary care settings with the resources and the types of presentations that are coming, this isn't always necessary either to be coming to a very specific diagnosis, because the majority of cases that we see in musculoskeletal care and primary care are generally self-limiting. But there are signs and symptoms of cases that may potentially need further diagnostic tests and imaging to be able to confirm, such as people with leg dominant pain is one prime example.
I've got two follow-on questions just to hijack the conversation a bit, Ewan. So, because I think one of our difficulties as doctors is the perceptions that people come to us and they want a label. They always need a diagnosis. So they're never very comfortable with the idea, it's nothing too serious, just please go away. So I think that's one interesting reflection. What is the sort of reception of people coming to physiotherapy and being told they have not been given a diagnosis? I said, this is the first question. And the second question is, I can clearly see there in terms of the action of raising awareness for myelopathy that something like diagnostic criteria or some sort of system that puts it into the red flags category is going to be really influential in the psychology of a physiotherapist.
Yeah, I agree, Ben. And it comes back to that paper that was published a couple of years ago when they asked patients, what does my patient with back pain want? And different clinicians had different approaches in terms of what they thought was important. But what patients wanted was essentially an explanation for what they think is going on, whether this is going to get better, strategies that they can use to get it better, rather than diagnostics, injections, and surgery, dare I say, depending on the condition, obviously. One of the shifts that's happened in physiotherapy is while we try and identify specific signs where people may have a specific diagnosis that needs early escalation of care, but also it's important, we put a lot of importance on trying to understand what is the prognosis of this patient. While we don't have the capacity to necessarily make a specific diagnosis for all our patients, if we can have a proposed hypothesis on how well this patient is going to improve over a condition trajectory, then we can effectively say, okay, if they haven't improved by this point, I know which pathways I have available to escalate care. And to your second point regarding getting myelopathy and DCM within this red flag criteria, I think that's quite important because physiotherapists and primary care providers and GPs have had a lot of emphasis on quad equina syndrome in the lumbar spine. It's something that people ask whether there's context to ask or whether there's no context to ask, whether people have leg pain or not. It's just generally something that physiotherapists and GPs know to ask, that do you have any bowel bladder dysfunction? It's generally a question that all our primary care providers, GPs and physios are all asking in people with back pain. So I think it is important for myelopathy, DCM, to have that recognition as something that, while it's not something in a lot of cases needing urgent intervention and referrals to EDs, it is something that we should consider that may need a specific trajectory of escalation to different specialists to get a confirmed diagnosis.
Agreed. That's fascinating. Ewan, sorry, back to you.
Yeah, I've got one more question, and probably the most asked question apart from pain and myelopathy, and this was discussed yesterday. Why does the cold affect us so much? And the heat of the summer months gives us a bit of a spring in our steps where we can sort of push ourselves a little more with less pain.
Thanks, Ewan. I would like to have an answer for that, and while I could hypothesize, I'd be wrong too. I don't think I'd be able to answer that.
A mystery. A mystery.
A
A
mystery.
mystery. It will forever be a mystery.
It's certainly common. We see it in people with OA, whether it be the knee or hip, and people with back pain. We do see it in people who say, yeah, the cold affects me differently, but it's not something I've been able to explain, or not necessarily something I've looked into particularly.
Another fantastic interview. And before I ask you about your perspective, Ben, I just want to say, isn't it great how the work of Myelopathy.org is able to cut across the world, and reach, New Zealand and other countries?
It's really been fantastic. And, if you think about our first few conversations, 10 years ago, the fact that we have got an audience now in New Zealand is really powerful. And I think for a disease which remains a small community, we really need to harness every single person out there who's interested. And it's the charity that seems to be able to bring them together. It's really, really great to see.
And getting back to Rohil's great interview, Ben, what are your takeaways from that in-depth conversation?
Well, I take away really two simple things, I think. The first is that it seems that having an expert triage point is really critical to the myelopathy pathway. So people like Rohil, who are specifically trained to look at those at-risk groups and identify myelopathy within them, that seems to be really effective. But it also seems that the key challenge is to get people to think DCM so that people then come to someone like Rohil, who can help untangle the various different symptoms that people present with. And it seems there is the big challenge. We've got to try and plant the seed in the very, very frontline professionals of possible DCM. And if we can do that, then the pathway seems to flow. And that was also the findings from his survey. So I guess the lessons are that it's perhaps less of a problem in the sense of focusing on a very small part of the pathway. But equally, I think that part of the pathway is probably the most challenging. But I do hope that our diagnostic criteria that are coming along slowly could be a really helpful intervention for that specific task.
Yeah, and it's all good news. Like I've said before, we've come a long way, and things are just improving all the time. I've just realized this is our last podcast for 2023. We've had some great interviews. I'm looking forward to season. What season will it be? It will be season 5 then, isn't it?
I think it will be, yeah. And 2024. And our first guest lined up actually is Rohil's equivalent from the United Kingdom, to get his sense on the lessons that Rohil's trying to translate into practice for the UK.
Keep doing what you're doing, guys. Keep raising awareness, and we can build a better pathway for people with DCM, I think.
So thanks very much to Rohil Chauhan for joining us. A very happy Christmas to you wherever you are. This was Myelopathy Matters from Myelopathy.org. The podcast, as always, produced by Carl Homer from Cambridge TV. To keep up to date with the latest in the field of degenerative cervical myelopathy, why not subscribe on your favourite podcast app, where you'll also find all of the previous episodes. There's, of course, lots more information and support to be found at Myelopathy.org. Please do get in touch at any time at ben@myelopathy.org. But until next time, goodbye.